welcome to The Force and Freedom, Part 5. Last time I finished laying out what I think are the central ideas of A New Hope. First, there's an important kind of unfreedom, one where someone determines not just whether I have certain options, but the very terms of engagement, the rules for how we'll decide how to resolve our disagreements. This kind of unfreedom typically arises through fear. That's what the Death Star is for. The Death Star is a kind of unfreedom generator for the Empire, a control generator. So by conquering fear, you can achieve some freedom. That's what Han Solo's all about, not being afraid. But by learning not to see everything in the terms the Dominator presents, you achieve more freedom. And by letting go of yourself, you achieve even more freedom, even more ability to control the terms of engagement. That's what the Jedi are all about, not letting others control the terms of engagement. They do it by learning to see the situation in a different light, and by letting go of themselves. That's what Obi-Wan's sacrifice is all about. Now, it's unclear whether this is a complete solution in two senses. First, is learning all this enough to give me real personal freedom? That's the question that came up when Han Solo showed up to save Luke. Luke's understanding of the ways of the Force was not enough to destroy the Death Star by itself. Second, does learning all this make me fit to be a guardian of others' freedom? That's the question that came up at the end when we saw that the Rebel Awards ceremony looked a lot like a Nazi rally from a famous Nazi documentary. Are these people fit to rule? I also suggested we get a hint of this in the reactor trench when Obi-Wan has to turn off the tractor beam. He has to stand on a narrow ledge as he powers down the tractor beam, suggesting that turning off control in the Empire is a very delicate thing to do. It's hard to maintain balance and order when you turn off the fear that keeps the local systems in line. Now that we've got an overview of the ideas of Star Wars in mind, I want to go back and see the significance of a couple of other parts. First, I think there's something interesting about starting the film in the desert after the opening battle. As we've seen, the images in the opening battle present a conflict between two sorts of values, freedom and order. In the opening battle, we're presented with one possible outcome of this conflict. Order wins and freedom is suppressed. The desert planet Tatooine suggests two alternatives. The first is isolation. There's no need for social order if there's no society. Everyone is free to go their own way. And that's exactly what happens to the two droids in the desert. They come to a disagreement about which way to go, and since there's nothing compelling them to arrive at some consensus, they each go their own way. Total freedom. You just need to get away from other people. According to the script, Jundland means no man's land. But as C-3PO remarks, this isn't a great condition to live in.
What a desolate place this is.
You avoid limits to your freedom, but at the cost of all the benefits of living in society. And as it turns out, because there's no order, there's no guarantee that you avoid limits to your freedom. Before long, both 3PO and R2 are enslaved and dragged back into a kind of society. This is a second alternative to Empire. Life in contact with others, but without much order. And for this alternative, too, it's significant that they're in a desert. Deserts have an association with freedom in U.S. filmmaking because U.S. deserts are in the West, and the West used to be the frontier of the United States. An inhabited place, but a place beyond or on the fringes of the reach of the law. This is a classic subject for a Western. Life on the fringes of civilization, freedom without order. And there's some romance to it, but it's ultimately not a very attractive possibility for any except those with the power to impose their own will. The freedom that allows Obi-Wan to cut off an arm and Han to shoot first is the same freedom that almost gets Luke killed.
You'll be dead!
And by the way, Han's approach to freedom comes straight out of Westerns. And it works a lot better in a Western context than in a rebellion against an empire. In a Western, no one has so much power that they can impose their will absolutely, and so those who can hold their own in a gunfight do well enough. It's no mistake, then, that Han is dressed as a cowboy. The shirt, the vest, the boots, the cavalry pants, the low-slung holster on his gun belt, and in case we don't catch the reference, we meet him in a Wild West saloon. Casting director Diane Crittenden said, "George knew what he wanted. He wanted Han to be a cowboy, the James Dean character. But instead of a horse, he's got a spaceship. Luke was a farmer. I said, 'What do you mean a farmer?' And he said, 'It's a moon farm or an interplanetary farm.'" It's also no mistake that Han is so focused on himself. In the Western, the heroes were often individuals who valued their independence so much that they preferred life in the desert. You don't become a cowboy because you love political causes and civilization. Anyway, the desert plays an important role in developing the main problem of the movie. We see in the opening battle that there can be a conflict between freedom and order. In the desert, we see why we can't just ditch order. So given that we're committed to freedom, somehow we need to find space for freedom in order. As I mentioned before in talking about social contract theory, agreeing on terms of engagement, agreeing on the laws, is an important step in constituting our freedom. The Wild West is a place without any law or without sufficient enforcement, so its inhabitants have no guarantee that others will treat them in ways that they can agree to. So for all its seeming freedom, the Wild West is missing a very important kind of freedom. People like Obi-Wan enjoy freedom there because they can enforce their own terms of engagement. But Luke and his family can't go out at night because it's too dangerous with all the sand people around. A second point to notice is that the scenes following the initial space battle repeatedly raise questions about freedom. R2 and 3PO have an argument about getting into the escape pod. 3PO doesn't like it.
Hey, you're not permitted in there. It's restricted. You'll be deactivated for sure.
R2 responds by calling him, which apparently includes the accusation that 3PO is a mindless philosopher. 3PO is scared of getting caught, but R2 is on a mission that makes the usual rules irrelevant. Presumably, he calls 3PO a philosopher because he won't take action. He's all words. But he's mindless because he has no mind of his own. He's thoroughly under the control of the people who set the rules. In fact, not only does 3PO not have a mind of his own, he has few words of his own. His strong point is translation and interpretation, repeating what somebody else has said in another language. He's a protocol droid. He's good at etiquette, at doing all the things you're supposed to do. His character is pretty well summed up in this exchange.
Can you speak Bocce?
Of course I can, sir. It's like a second language to me. I'm a
Yeah, all right, shut up. I'll take this.
Shutting up, sir.
Even when 3PO makes a decision for himself, like when he parts with R2 in the desert, he ends up blaming it on R2.
That malfunctioning little twerp. This is all his fault. He tricked me into going this way, but he'll do no better.
The idea of taking responsibility for his own decisions is totally foreign to 3PO. You can't be free if you're so thoroughly under others' control. When R2 and 3PO are captured by Jawas, they're fitted with restraining bolts. And of course, R2 finds a clever way to get rid of his, but 3PO doesn't.
He says the restraining bolt has short-circuited his recording system. He suggests that if you remove the bolt, he might be able to play back the entire recording.
In the very next scene, Luke asks his uncle if he can head off to join the academy, and his uncle refuses. Another issue of freedom. Then Luke goes back to find R2 gone. The sandwiching of the R2 scenes around Luke's conversation with his uncle poses a question. We know what was keeping R2 from going on his mission, the restraining bolt. But what's keeping Luke from going on his mission? The obvious answer is his uncle. But what's making him do what his uncle tells him? From what Luke says later, it sounds like it's related to fear of his uncle.
Boy, am I gonna get it.
This isn't as terrifying as fear of the Death Star. It might not even be a threat of violence. Although in an early synopsis of the plot, Lucas wrote that at the dinner when Owen tells him he can't go to the academy, they argue and Owen strikes the boy, who's protected by Beru. But in the actual film, it's more like 3PO's mindless philosophy, a fear of what's restricted. It probably arose from past threats of punishment.
I'm not going to Alderaan. I've got to get home. It's late. I'm in port as it is.
But how can Luke be punished when he's gone? Now, I think these scenes are particularly important for posing the issue because Luke's situation is so like our situation. Weapons of mass destruction don't loom large in most viewers' lives like the Death Star. It isn't fear of the atomic bomb that restricts our freedom, at least in most cases. It's fear of the people in our lives, of our parents, our colleagues or bosses, of our peers, even of our friends. And that's another important feature of the setting on Tatooine. If the desert brings to mind the western of our imagination, the Skywalker homestead turns out to be the familiar American household, almost to the point of stereotype. It's so familiar that the mother figure doesn't even seem to be wearing much of a costume. If any Star Wars character could walk into an Applebee's without anybody batting an eye, it's Aunt Beru. Luke and Owen dress in some kind of robes, seemingly Japanese-inspired, and Aunt Beru is wearing a denim jacket. It's as if the costume is trying to say, "This is you, typical American family." Now that does something interesting to the movie. We started out long ago and far, far away in the middle of a space battle, which distances us from the conflict. It suggests this is just escapist entertainment. We can leave the troubles of this world behind and be entertained by the troubles of another world. But then 10 minutes later, we find out that that battle was not so far away after all. because it turns out to have some relevance to the typical American family. And how does it become relevant? Well, first, think about how Luke learns about the battle. He watches a movie. Maybe you didn't quite think of it this way, but the first time we see Princess Leia, she's just finishing up an indie movie. And Luke reacts to this indie movie the way that a typical entertainment-seeking teenager reacts to a movie.
She's beautiful.
In fact, the way that Luke is responding to this movie is one of the main ways people have tended to react to Star Wars itself, as entertainment. And it is entertaining, but it's trying to say something else. It's trying to turn your attention towards an important conflict, just like Leia is trying to grab attention for the rebellion in her movie. It's fitting that seeing the full message is going to require Luke to release the restraining bolt on the droid. He needs to let the droid take him places that he didn't anticipate. Places he probably wouldn't have allowed the droid to take him had he realized what was going on. In this case, out to the Genland Wastes. So contrary to the charge that Star Wars is simply escapist fantasy, I see this. Star Wars is at least partly a film about the power of film to get us thinking about the bigger political questions. It's a film that says, hey you, typical American, ogling Carrie Fisher, wake up. This is more than entertainment. There are important ideas here, and they call for action. Of course, even when Luke does get the full message, he's still resistant. He's got other things to take care of. The battle over freedom and order is not something he can afford to take on. The next plot point, I think, is a direct response to this resistance, and is probably the most shockingly graphic scene of the entire trilogy. Certainly more graphic than the scene from The Searchers it's modeled on. Luke returns home to take care of his responsibilities to his family, only to find the homestead aflame, and amidst the smoke, the charred bodies of Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru. It's as if the film is saying, you can't ignore these issues about freedom and order in society because you've got too much going on in your own life. They can rip right through your life. They can rip right through your typical American family. In short, these scenes are practically telling the audience to think about the movie, like Luke should think about the message, and to act on it. Lucas explained, when the challenge comes with Ben at his home after he gets Leia's message, Luke immediately rejects it. He wants to go fight the Empire. You can tell he wants to. But he doesn't feel that he can take on the responsibility. As a result, destiny comes into play. Because if you don't do anything about the Empire will eventually crush you. Lucas continued, to not make a decision is a decision. It happens in all countries when a certain force, which everybody thinks is wrong, begins to take over, and nobody decides to stand up against it. Or the people who stand up against it can't rally enough support. What usually happens is a small minority stands up against it, and the major portion are a lot of indifferent people who aren't doing anything one way or the other. And by not accepting the responsibility, those people will eventually have to confront the issue in a more painful way, which is essentially what happened in the United States with the Vietnam War. Now, maybe you're a bit skeptical about my interpretation here. But this business of Luke's encountering the rebellion in the form of an indie film is actually part of a broader autobiographical thread running throughout the movie. The young George Lucas had some important things in common with Luke. They both liked racing. Lucas raced cars when he was young until he got into a terrible crash that almost ended his life. They both wanted to head off to an academy to learn more. In Lucas's case, this was film school at USC. And they both had father figures who opposed these dreams and wanted them to do something more practical. Mark Hamill, who played Luke, said, George is Luke. He is. I always felt that way. I even went so far as to do his little beard gestures. George even gave me his nickname, the Kid. They used to call George the Kid until he grew his beard. I'm really playing him in the movie. Now, when I claim that Luke is inspired by Leia's indie film to go on a journey, there's an important parallel with George Lucas's life. Because Lucas himself was inspired by indie films to leave his hometown and go to film school to become a filmmaker. I mentioned earlier that Lucas wrote in his notes while working on the second draft, Luke reluctantly accepts the burden. Artist, not a warrior. Fear. Why is Lucas putting an artist in this story? Because Luke is Lucas. I've already discussed the parallels between imperial control and the way that fear of career consequences could have controlled Lucas's artistic freedom, but we can add a few more examples. When George Lucas moved to Los Angeles to go to film school, he already had connections with an experienced cinematographer named Haskell Wexler. Wexler had his own film company, but Wexler couldn't get Lucas a job in his own company unless Lucas was willing to join the union, and Lucas didn't want to join. That became Lucas's first major frustration with the filmmaking machine in Los Angeles. He later said, "I was disposed against it, mainly because of my first experience trying to get a job with Haskell and not being able to. Being shut out. I thought it was extremely unfair." I've already talked about Lucas's indignation at Universal Studios for cutting 4 minutes from American Graffiti. His sister Wendy said, that was the beginning of his passion to become an independent filmmaker, so that he would have total control over his films and not be under some MBA studio executive who himself had never written or directed or edited a film from the ground up. Lucas once said, "I don't mind getting input from the creative people around me, but not the executives. I fought for many years to make sure no one could tell me what to do." I've also already pointed out that the Rebel pilot's debriefing looks like a film class. Just as Lucas went to film school, we see Luke in a sort of film class towards the end of A New Hope. The parallel in Lucas's life to Luke shutting off the navigating computer was something like realizing that if you want to make a movie that means something, technical skills and following instructions are not enough. You have to fly, or film, by instinct. This autobiographical element in Lucas's filmmaking runs throughout the 6 Star Wars films Lucas made and beyond. Lucas even made a film in film school called Freiheit, the German for freedom. It's about a student trying to escape across the border from communist East Germany to democratic West Germany. I'll probably make reference to these autobiographical elements of Lucas's filmmaking from time to time as we work through the films, but I'll treat it as a side story or an example of the more general ideas I'm after. In the end, even those of us who interpret Star Wars don't watch Star Wars to learn about who George Lucas is. We watch Star Wars to think about who we are and what the world is like. Lucas was successful in creating films that speak to the human condition partly because he channeled his own experiences into the films. But it's the human condition that makes the films worth watching again and again, not the details of Lucas's experience of it. So to underline this, I want to give you one more example of Jedi strategy from Lucas's lifetime that I think is even better than Lucas's own biography: the nonviolent resistance of civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. King used nonviolent resistance as a strategy to resist Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws established all sorts of unequal treatment for black people in the South in the United States. And if you didn't accept the unequal treatment, you got punished. Now, punishments are calculated to be unpleasant, to force you into accepting the laws as the terms of engagement. So if you don't want Jim Crow laws to be the terms of engagement in your society, it seems like you might need some way of avoiding punishment. But it's hard to resist punishment without violence. Fighting fire with fire, Han Solo style. The problem is, law enforcement has an advantage of training and equipment. It's going to be hard to win that fight. The idea of nonviolent resistance is that you resist the unequal treatment, but you don't resist punishment. And at first, maybe that doesn't sound very promising, because you're still accepting terms they dictate to you. You're accepting the punishment, and the punishment is unpleasant. You might think, look, if I'm going to accept something, I might as well accept the unequal treatment, because at least then I get the benefit of not being punished. But the insight behind nonviolent resistance is that it draws society's attention to the injustice of the punishment. You see the sharp contrast between the civility of the people going to jail and the barbarity of the people sending them there. And when a society can recognize that, they start to put pressure on the oppressors to get rid of the unequal treatment. Notice how nonviolent resistance actually changes the terms of engagement. Punishment was designed to be unwelcome. The harsher the punishment, the less people are willing to commit crime. But nonviolent resistance flips that around. The harshness of the punishment is precisely what makes accepting it an effective tool of resistance. Nonviolent resistors wanted to be punished, not because they like harsh treatment in itself, but because the injustice of harsh treatment is what motivates society to make changes. It's like Obi-Wan and Darth Vader. Vader thinks the winner is the person who kills the other person with a lightsaber. He doesn't realize that that's not the game Obi-Wan is playing at all. In Obi-Wan's game, getting killed in front of Luke is a good thing, because that will allow him to inspire Luke to great deeds. Obi-Wan flips the game on Vader. He makes Vader's victory into a victory for himself, so Vader ends up unwittingly helping Obi-Wan win. Same thing with Martin Luther King Jr. Punishment seemed like a victory for Jim Crow laws, but nonviolent resistors turned it into a victory against the Jim Crow laws, so that by sending the resistors to jail, law enforcers were undermining the very laws they were enforcing. I like how King described this in his last speech. Referring to Bull Connors, the guy who ordered the Birmingham police to use attack dogs and fire hoses on the nonviolent resistors, King said, He knew a kind of physics that somehow didn't relate to the trans physics that we knew about. In other words, Bull Connors was so trapped in his mindset, according to which violent force decides the winner, that he just couldn't understand what the protesters were up to, and why fire hoses and dogs were only going to help them in the end. Now that's Jedi strategy on the grand scale, but we can also find Jedi strategy in everyday circumstances. Let me see if I can give you one more example of Jedi strategy from my own life. Once as a child, I got in a fight with my brother. Actually, many times as a child, I got in a fight with my brother. And if my dad stepped in to resolve the fight, he would sometimes ask each for his side of the story. And the typical response was to list all the things the other had done wrong, to try to make it look like the fight was entirely his fault. But on one of those occasions, I don't know what came over me, but suddenly I had the thought that I should just focus on acknowledging my own contributions to escalating the conflict. So I did. And it worked like a charm. My dad said to my brother, "Look, he's acknowledging and apologizing for what he did. Why aren't you acknowledging your contributions?" My brother ended up with a hefty punishment, and I hardly got any. I think what I did was Jedi-like in two ways. First, I stepped back from my ingrained way of seeing the situation and took a wider perspective. Instead of seeing it as a chance to try to win my dad's sympathy for my complaints against my brother, I thought about what my dad really wanted, and I tried to give it to him. Second, to do that, I needed to get over myself. I needed to let go of the story of an innocent victim and think about the ways that I wasn't living up to what my dad wanted. It's nowhere near the order of Obi-Wan sacrificing himself for the rebellion, but maybe it's the infantile equivalent. And just like Obi-Wan, I can't claim to have done it without any guile. Okay. I've probably given you more examples of Jedi strategy than you really wanted to sit through, so I'll let it rest. The key takeaway is that threats to freedom are all over the place, and the Jedi approach to them can yield some really stunning results. I suppose that here's as good a place as any to say a word about what I'm trying to do as an interpreter. As I promised at the beginning of the podcast, I'm trying to show what Star Wars can mean to us, what relevance it has to our world. Now, there are a lot of great ways to interpret movies, often with very different aims. What I try to achieve in my interpretations are two things. First, I like to think of my way of interpreting films as listening to what the film is saying to me. It's like listening because it tries to approach the film without preconceptions about what the film is saying. It tries to take its cues from the film. Some other ways of interpreting approach films with an ideological lens and interpret what's going on in the film through that lens. And that's fine if you want to practice using one of those lenses, or if you want to propagandize one of those ideologies, or if you want to criticize the film using a specific evaluative standard. But if you want to learn something new from a film, I find it's really helpful to put the lenses away and to listen. And it involves doing one's best to let the person or film you're listening to take the lead. I find that letting the film take the lead often involves looking for interpretations that unite many sundry aspects of the movie into one coherent whole. Listening involves putting the ideas together in a way that the communicator is suggesting that you put them together. And I don't mean there's just one right way. Some of the best art tries to communicate to us about many things. One of the best ways to make sure that you're on a good track with your interpretation is to see whether it squares with the rest of the movie. The reason I'm confident that the remote Luke trains with is a symbol of fear as a threat to freedom is that the two previous scenes with similar objects have associated those objects with fear as a threat to freedom. And that idea fits in well with my understanding of the rest of the images, with the contrast between Han's and Obi-Wan's approach, etc. Now, it's possible to take things too far, to find patterns that aren't there. I may be guilty of that on occasion. But that doesn't mean that looking for patterns in general is the wrong strategy. It just means we have to be cautious. The second thing I'm looking for in an interpretation is that it connects with our reality, our world, our lives. I want to find something in the movie that speaks not just to the world of the movie, but to our own. It's fun to escape to a story from a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. But it's more exciting to me if I can find something there that I can bring back with me. And better still if it was something that I didn't understand already. So you can see why the autobiographical elements in the film aren't the most interesting, because they only connect with the real world in a narrow sort of way, with the life of a specific individual I don't even know. But I think these autobiographical elements can be indirectly interesting in two ways. First, they can serve as good examples of the interesting ideas in a film. And second, they can be good clues for finding those ideas. The creator's intention or even subconscious motivation aren't the only possible sources for an interesting idea in a movie, but they're not bad sources. And if you're looking for interesting ideas in a film, thinking about the creator or creators isn't a bad source to turn to. Of course, there are other good ways to interpret films, but now you have an idea of mine. I hope that this discussion has convinced you of the error of scholars like Michael Pye and Linda Miles, who wrote that Star Wars is a void into which any mystic idea can be projected, an entertainment brilliantly confected, which is quite hollow. Its only idea is individualism, that a man must take responsibility for others, even at great personal cost and peril. Its idea is, in classic form, a man's gotta do what a man's gotta do. That last phrase is famously associated with John Wayne Westerns. But as I've been explaining, one of the main ideas of Star Wars is precisely to cast doubt on the ideals of the Western. It's Han Solo's cowboyish individualism that makes him the weak link in the rescue party. And while they're right that the film portrays taking responsibility for others in a positive light, or as I've talked about it, caring about something beyond yourself, the idea isn't that a man must take responsibility for others. The idea is that taking responsibility for others can set you free from the slavery of worrying only about your own well-being. As for the claim that Star Wars is a void into which any mystic idea can be projected, not only is it false, I think it's a sign of the film's art that its ideas aren't blasted so loudly that you're compelled to think about them. Star Wars is about freedom. What better way to respect the viewer's freedom than not to subject them to an extended harangue? Star Wars keeps the ideas subtle enough that they're available if you want to think about them, and if not, you're free to escape to a faraway galaxy. I'll finish with a thought that'll lead us into The Empire Strikes Back. I haven't said very much about the dark side. I have suggested something that distinguishes the Jedi from Vader. Obi-Wan seems ready to sacrifice himself for others. But there's more to talk about here in A New Hope. For example, there's a distinction and even a rivalry between the Death Star and the dark side of the Force. We see this in the conference room debate on the Death Star. They're both sources of power, and the debate is which is greater. Darth Vader doesn't really explain what the Force is when he asserts that it's more powerful than the Death Star, but a series of scenes involving Governor Tarkin and Darth Vader suggest some distinctions. Tarkin tries to use the threat of destroying Alderaan to force Leia to divulge the location of the rebel base. But Leia refuses, as Vader has already predicted. Somehow Vader has insight into people's motivations. This becomes evident again when Vader senses Obi-Wan's presence on the Death Star. He knows that Obi-Wan doesn't plan to escape. After the heroes have escaped from the Death Star, we find out that Vader has had a tracking beacon placed aboard their ship. This is clearly Vader's plan, not Tarkin's. Tarkin has only reluctantly agreed.
I'm taking an awful risk, Vader. This had better work.
Notice that the plan again involves clever manipulation, not unlike the manipulation we've seen Obi-Wan use. Vader wins some battles by brute force, but his real power is in his wits, in his awareness of people's motivations and plans, and his ability to manipulate them for his own ends. In comparison with that, the Death Star is a blunt weapon indeed. It broadcasts a general fear of an enormous power, but it's not responsive to the different motivations and plans of its enemies. It is, as Vader puts it, a mechanical terror. It's no accident that the Death Star is destroyed by a band of rebels who have stolen its plans and found a weak spot. Fear can be generated by such crude methods as the Death Star, but without a more sophisticated understanding of the people it's trying to dominate, the Empire won't be able to maintain control. The initial demonstration of Vader's power in a way underscores this thought. The Death Star can blow up a planet, and Vader can suffocate a human being. From the comparison, one might think that the Death Star is more powerful. But what if the human being who's being suffocated is the commander of the Death Star? Power is about more than firepower. Power is also about control over the people who have the firepower. We'll see these ideas about the dark side developed in the next movie, The Empire Strikes Back. That's it for the first short season of The Force and Freedom. If you have any thoughts about the season, questions, comments, ideas, I'd love to hear them. Write to me at theforceandfreedom@gmail.com. I've already recorded most of the second season, which is about Empire Strikes Back. And let me tell you, it's very exciting stuff. But it's also going to take some work to finish it up, and the finishing part of the work is the boring part. So if you want that process to go faster, here are some things you can do. Like the podcast, write a positive review, share it with some people you think might like it, or just put it out there on social media for friends to click on. Post it to forums online like Reddit. The more people listen to this podcast, the more motivated I am to get the second season done. I want to thank some people for their help with this project. First, Megan, for listening to early versions of these ideas, giving me helpful feedback on each episode, and generously providing a home for the pump organ. I want to thank Johnny for the excellent logo. I thank Laura, Ani, Daryl, Lena, and Susan for very supportively listening to early versions of this material. Thanks to Lindenfield for mixing and touching up the music and teaching me some podcast audio techniques. A big thanks to Joseph for collaborating with me on the class that led me to these thoughts. I want to thank Aaron, Megan, and Lindenfield for giving me the microphone on which this podcast was recorded. Thanks to Susan, whom I call Mom, for purchasing the cello and the cello lessons. And thanks to all the other friends and family members who have encouraged me on this project. Finally, the Force and Freedom notes that Laura, mentioned above, is accepting candidates for the position of boyfriend. Do you have a doctoral degree or higher and moderate fitness level? Are you able to operate power tools? Willing to assume all cooking responsibilities or else enjoy beans and rice every day of your life? Have you been or are you currently in therapy for emotional intelligence? Do you appreciate group flossing and understand basic physics as it applies to everyday life, such as unpacking shelves before trying to carry them downstairs, or the stabilizing effect of a shark's dorsal fin to prevent roll and yaw? If you found yourself repeatedly exclaiming, "Why yes, that's me," as I read these questions, please write to theforceandfreedom@gmail.com with the subject line, Boyfriend Application. Until next time, may the Force be with you.